My name is Erin Collins, and I was told I didn't belong, that I was just the girl left with the old man. But years later, I stood in a courtroom and made my father watch as I shredded every false report he used to try and steal my inheritance. I slammed the folder shut, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Next time you lie in court, make sure the lawyer isn't your daughter. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's with me. And if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, this story is for you." The Florida heat was a living thing that day. Thick and wet and clingy, like the lies I'd learned to wring out of my life later. But back then, I was 16, barefoot, and seething on Grandpa Walter's porch as my older brother Jason leaned against the banister with that signature smirk, the one he always wore when he knew he could get away with something. "I'll be drinking pina coladas with Mom and Dad while you rot with Gramps," he said, his voice syrupy and slow, like he was already halfway through a tropical cocktail. I clenched my fists so hard my fingernails left little crescent moons in my palms. "I'd rather learn something real from Grandpa than sit next to liars like you." Jason's laughter was sharp and mean, bouncing off the porch columns. "Good luck with that. All he teaches is chess and conspiracy theories." Turned on his heel and sauntered off, back to the sleek black SUV my parents had just packed up for a spontaneous family getaway, one that didn't include me. Again, that's when I heard the slow creak of the screen door behind me. "Let him talk," Grandpa Walter said, resting a hand on my shoulder. His skin was warm and dry, a stark contrast to the sticky air. "You've got more fire than the rest of them combined." And just like that, the anger in my chest loosened. Not gone, just tempered. I turned to face him, blinking against the sun as it flared gold behind his silver hair. "Why do they treat me like this?" I asked. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "Like I'm not one of them." Grandpa's gaze drifted across the porch, past the overgrown yard, to the dusty road where the SUV had disappeared. "Because you see them for what they are. That's dangerous to people who build their lives on pretending." He stepped inside, leaving the door open behind him, an unspoken invitation. I followed, of course. I always followed Grandpa Walter. Inside, the house smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and faint pipe tobacco, the only place in my world where nothing was fake. "Come on," he said, not bothering to look back as he made his way to the study. "Let's see if we can turn some of that fire into focus." He never once asked if I wanted to stay with him. He knew. I wanted to, needed to. My parents had dropped me off that morning with barely a goodbye, said something vague about needing space to work things out with Jason, something about letting Erin cool off. But I wasn't the one who needed cooling. I was the one who was finally warming up. I sat down in Grandpa's study, surrounded by dusty books, old legal pads, and stacks of yellowing newspaper clippings. The whir of the ceiling fan overhead was the only sound for a moment as he rummaged through a drawer. Jason had once said Grandpa was just an old man playing lawyer in his bathrobe. But that bathrobe held more wisdom than any of Dad's sleek suits. Walter Collins had practiced law for 40 years before retirement, and while the town had long forgotten him, he hadn't forgotten a thing. "Want to see how liars fall apart under pressure?" he asked, pulling out a thick file and tossing it onto the desk with a thud. I blinked. "That's a real case file. Real trial, real lies. Real consequences." He looked me in the eye. "You learn how to read between the lines, and no one can use words to trap you again." I didn't say anything. Just opened the folder, my heart suddenly pounding not with rage but with something scarier, purpose. The first time I walked into Grandpa Walter's study alone, I didn't knock. I didn't need to. He never closed the door and he never said no. That was his rule, unspoken but sacred. If the door's open, you walk through it. The study smelled like him, aged leather, pine soap, and ink. The air was thick with stories, though no one else seemed to notice. My parents always treated it like a forgotten museum wing. Jason used to call it the dungeon. He'd never set foot past the threshold. But to me, it was a cathedral. I used to sit in the high-backed chair across from Grandpa's desk and watch the way his fingers danced over casebooks, deft and steady, like a pianist who'd long since mastered the keys. We never played checkers. That's what my parents assumed when they dropped me off for the summer. They thought I was wasting my time with an old man clinging to old ideas. But each afternoon, when the sun stretched long through the slatted blinds and the heat made everything move a little slower, Grandpa would slide a different book across the desk. "Contract law today," he said once, sipping iced tea from a cloudy glass. Don't let the word agreement fool you. People agree to stab each other in the back all the time. I raised an eyebrow, pencil poised above my notepad. Sounds dramatic. Real life is, he muttered, especially when family's involved. That made me pause. Is that what happened with Dad? I asked. Grandpa didn't answer right away. He leaned back, eyes narrowing like he was watching a memory replay on the ceiling. Let's just say I trusted the wrong people and gave too much without thinking they'd take more. He tapped the table twice. How I've got you. He said it so simply, so surely. And it was the first time in my life I felt like someone had picked me, not out of obligation, not because I was the convenient daughter left behind, but because they wanted to. That night I couldn't sleep. The fan in my room clicked every few seconds, and the Florida cicadas outside screamed into the dark like they were mourning something. I kept replaying that moment over and over. Now I've got you. The next morning, I made a decision. I started getting up earlier, brushing the dew off the porch chairs before Grandpa came outside. I'd pour the coffee, black for him, sweet for me. Then we'd talk, not just about law but life, how people twist the truth when money's involved, how some folks write their loyalty in pencil and keep the eraser close. One day he slid a thin, worn folder across the table. This, he said, is the first case I ever lost. I opened it slowly. Yellowed papers. Red pen. His name stamped at the bottom. Why show me this? Because losing teaches you more than winning ever will. You learn how people lie, how they deflect, how they turn a courtroom into a stage. He leaned closer, voice low like a secret. And you learn how to see through it. Each lesson wasn't just academic, it was personal. I didn't realize it then, but Grandpa wasn't just teaching me the law. He was teaching me how to fight. And I was learning fast. While Jason was on jet skis with our parents in Key West, I was studying torts and precedent under the whir of a dusty ceiling fan. One afternoon, as thunder rolled in the distance and the sky turned a bruised blue, Grandpa said something I'd never forget. Law is power, Aaron, he said, sliding another book my way. But power without integrity is just noise. I looked down at the cover, Trial Strategy and Witness Tactics. How old were you when you started law school? I asked. 21, he replied. Same year my father died, didn't have a choice, had to grow up fast. I nodded, fingers brushing the edge of the book. Seems like the Collins family has a habit of throwing daughters at the wolves early. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Difference is you've got teeth. That night I sat out on the porch alone, watching lightning flicker behind the trees. My parents hadn't called once all week. Not to check in. Not to ask how I was doing. And for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. They could have their margaritas and hotel rooms. I had something better. I had the truth. And someone finally teaching me what to do with it. The envelope didn't look like much, plain white, slightly creased, with no return address. I found it wedged awkwardly in the mailbox behind the usual stack of utility bills and takeout menus. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had mailed it to the wrong Collins. That happened more than you'd think. My mother was always getting my bank statements and never bothered forwarding them. But when I flipped it over, my name was written in crisp black ink. Just my name, no middle initial, no miss, no flourish, Aaron Collins. I carried it back inside like it might break if I held it wrong. The moment I tore it open and unfolded the letter, my fingers went numb. A full scholarship to Southern Atlantic Law. Tuition, housing, and living stipend. Funded by an anonymous donor who believed in my potential. My knees nearly gave out. I sat down hard on the edge of Grandpa's worn leather couch. I read it 3 times before I let myself believe it. I knew instantly who was behind it. No one else believed in me like that. No one else even saw me. I clutched the letter to my chest and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa." And then I smiled. Not the polite smile I wore at family dinners while my parents gushed about Jason's GPA or his networking brunches with their country club friends. This was different. This was mine. That night, I waited until the sky turned the color of ashes before I started packing. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not yet. They wouldn't ask anyway. They hadn't noticed when I changed my major from communications to pre-law. They hadn't asked why I stayed so long at Grandpa's, or why I stopped coming to family dinners entirely. But they'd notice when I left. I folded the letter into my suitcase, nestled between a stack of Grandpa's notes and my best thrift store blazer. The next morning, I dragged my suitcase across the driveway while my parents sat on the front porch drinking coffee, barely looking up. Jason was inside, probably still asleep after another weekend at some exclusive networking retreat paid for by my father. As I reached the car, my mother finally stirred. "Where are you going with all that?" she asked, voice more curious than concerned. I turned around slowly, every inch of me calm but alert. "To law school," I said simply. My father snorted. "Law school since when?" "Since always," I smiled. "You just never bothered to notice." He blinked like he hadn't heard me correctly. My mother frowned. "What about Jason's graduation next spring? We're planning the trip to California already." I closed the trunk with a satisfying thunk. "I'll send a card," I replied. She blinked at me like she was trying to place a distant relative. "And how exactly are you paying for this fantasy?" I paused, savoring it. "Someone believed in me," I said, and opened the car door. That's all I needed. As I slid into the driver's seat, Jason appeared at the front door, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "What's all the noise?" he mumbled, then he saw me. "Where are you going?" he asked, like I was breaking some unspoken family rule. I leaned out the window. "Somewhere better." Then I started the engine. No long goodbyes, no tears. Just the open road and the scholarship letter glowing beside me on the passenger seat. Atlanta was 5 hours away, but it might as well have been a different world. My new apartment was small, sunlit, and barely had space for my books and desk, but it was mine. No more passive-aggressive post-it notes on the fridge. No more watching Jason bask in praise while I was asked to be quiet, your brother's talking. The first night I sat at that cheap kitchen table, eating noodles out of a mug, I felt freer than I ever had. And then my phone buzzed, a text from Grandpa. "I knew you'd make it. Come by soon. I've got something for you." I smiled through the lump in my throat. He never asked if I was scared. He knew I was. But he also knew I wouldn't back down. That weekend, he drove up from Florida in his ancient green Buick, wearing a straw hat and a mischievous grin. He hugged me tight, then handed me a thick folder wrapped in a rubber band. Inside, my childhood drawings, legal pad sketches of imaginary courtrooms, and one sheet of paper I barely remembered writing. It was a scrawled contract, written in blue crayon with my name at the bottom. "Aaron Collins, future lawyer, justice is my job," I laughed. "Did I really write this?" "You always sign them Aaron J.D., Grandpa said, his voice soft. I kept every one. Tears blurred my eyes. "Why?" He looked at me like the answer was obvious. "Because I knew before you did. Law school didn't get easier. I just got louder." Not in the way my mother used to hiss across the dinner table when I asked too many questions, or how Jason would say, "Can you not make everything into a debate?" This was different. This was the kind of loud that came from knowing you had something worth saying. Southern Atlantic law was a battleground of ambition, privilege, and whispers behind closed doors. I wasn't the loudest. I wasn't the smartest. But I was the most stubborn, and in law school that mattered. I knew what it meant to be underestimated. I'd been trained for it since childhood. Every time a professor called on me expecting a fumble, I gave them a case citation and a counterargument. Every time a classmate raised an eyebrow at my thrifted heels or quiet Southern accent, I gave them a win on the mock trial team. But the best decision I made, I didn't do it alone. Melody was the first to find me. She had short pink hair, a double major in constitutional law and sarcasm, and she ran the student legal aid clinic like a bootleg general. "You want in?" she asked, sliding a coffee across the library table without even asking my name. "What makes you think I'm interested?" I asked. "You read Stare Decisis like it's poetry and mutter trial objections in your sleep," she said, deadpan. "You're already one of us." That's how it started. Me, Melody, and two others. Robbie, the tech wizard who could dig up sealed court records like it was child's play, and Gia, a soft-spoken but brutal cross-examiner who once made a tenured professor sweat during a classroom demonstration. We were all misfits. Kids who'd worked 2 jobs, who didn't have parents paying tuition, who knew what it meant to fight uphill. And together we became a unit. Our cases weren't glamorous. Tenants evicted without notice. Workers denied overtime. Elderly clients scammed by predatory contracts. But every win, no matter how small, was a rebellion, a line in the sand. "I never thought the law could look like this," Gia said once, thumbing through our clinic's latest win. "Like justice, real justice." I nodded. "It can, if the right people hold the pen." It was in the middle of one of our late-night study sessions. papers everywhere and Melody threatening to pour cold brew into her cereal, that my phone buzzed. Grandpa Walter coming up. Got something you need to see. Hope you're not too important to see your old man. I nearly dropped my highlighter. By the time he arrived the next afternoon, my apartment was clean, well cleaner, and my team was already camped on the floor, papers spread like we were planning a heist. Smells like ambition and old ramen in here, Grandpa said as he stepped in, waving at my startled teammates. You must be Walter, Melody said, grinning. She talks about you like you're Yoda in loafers. Grandpa laughed, settling into the armchair like he owned it. And you must be the pink-haired general. Heard a lot about you too. He stayed for hours watching us work, occasionally tossing out advice when we got stuck. Don't argue intent unless you've got proof or a witness with nothing to lose. Words on a lease don't mean squat if the landlord violates them. Never underestimate an old woman with a notarized letter. They usually win. Later that evening, when the team had gone home and the apartment quieted, he reached into his coat and pulled out a faded brown folder. What's that? I asked, settling beside him on the couch. Your legacy, he said, voice rougher than usual. Or at least the beginning of it. He handed it over and I opened it carefully. Inside were documents, land records, trust deeds, old wills, all with the name Aaron Collins scrawled in margins. Some had been marked decades ago. One had a sticky note in his handwriting. For her if the others fail. I looked up stunned. You've been planning this. I've been watching them, he said. And I've been watching you. They act like inheritance is just about money. It's not, it's about trust. And you're the only one I trust with what matters. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. He reached out, placing a hand over mine. You've built something real here, Aaron. A firm, a future, and most importantly, a spine. Don't let anyone twist that out of you. I won't, I whispered. I swear. He nodded slowly, eyes gleaming in the dim lamplight. That's my girl. I looked around the apartment, papers, books, my team's coffee mug still on the counter, and realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't temporary. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something. The hardest part wasn't building the firm. It was realizing my parents never planned to walk through the doors. Collins and Associates started with nothing but a borrowed desk, a chipped coffee machine, and 3 brave law school grads who didn't believe in waiting for permission. We leased a cramped office above a bakery in downtown Atlanta. The walls were thin, the AC worked on a part-time schedule, and the paint peeled around the windows, but it was ours. Our first sign, a cheap vinyl banner hung with hope and thumbtacks, read, "Justice isn't just for the wealthy." Clients trickled in. Mostly referrals. Single moms stiffed by employers, tenants dealing with slumlords, immigrant families terrified of paperwork they couldn't read. We didn't ask for much, just the truth. Your firm's not profitable yet, my mother said when she finally found out what I was doing. Her tone wasn't concerned, it was clinical, like she was reading a weather report. That's okay, I said, it's purposeful, she laughed. Purpose doesn't pay taxes. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say to someone who thought value could only be measured in returns. The last time I'd spoken to her before that, she was trying to convince me to help Jason apply for a grant. For a business idea he had. Something about tech and coffee shops, he couldn't even explain it. I just think it would look better if you signed off as a legal advisor, she said sweetly. You know how these committees love credentials. I said no. She didn't call for 7 months after that. Birthdays passed. So did Thanksgiving, Christmas. I stopped expecting cards or awkward voicemails. The silence stopped hurting after a while, it just became part of the weather. Do you think they'll ever come around? Melody asked one evening as we shared leftover Chinese in the office, feet up on the conference table. Maybe when they need something, I said, not bitter, just honest. You're okay with that? I thought about it. About how I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed. About the clients who lit up when I remembered their kids' names. About Grandpa Walter's handwriting on legal folders stacked behind my desk. I think I've learned how to live without applause, I said. And that's the real freedom. She nodded, chewing thoughtfully. Still, sucks that they can't see it. I shrugged. They see what they want, they always have. My office was now twice the size it used to be. We had 6 associates, an office manager, and a paralegal team that could rival most big firms in the city. We didn't wear suits unless we had to. Most days, I wore the same brown leather shoes I'd bought the first week of law school. They still clicked with authority when I walked into a room. On paper, I was a success story. But paper doesn't tell you what it feels like to stare at a blank Christmas card for an hour, wondering if you should send it anyway. Grandpa always called, though. Every birthday, every win, every loss. "You still reading people better than you read cases?" he asked one night. "Trying," I said. "Clients are easier than family," he chuckled. "That's 'cause clients tell you what they want, family expects you to guess it." I missed him more than I ever said out loud. He was getting older, slower, a little stiffer, but his mind was still sharp as glass. He visited less often, though. Said the travel wore him out. I understood. I just didn't like it. One morning in early spring, I was finishing up a deposition summary when Melody knocked gently on my door. "You have a call," she said, her voice unusually soft. "Take a message," I said, not looking up. "It's your mom." My hand froze over the keyboard. "She said it's about Grandpa." The world shifted. I stood slowly, stomach turning to stone. "Put her through," I whispered. The line crackled, then her voice tight, rehearsed. "Aaron, it's me. Your grandfather passed away last night, in his sleep." Silence, just that single sentence, dropped like a pebble into a still lake, but it hit like a meteor. "When's the funeral?" I asked, voice steady. 3 days, Saturday, he wanted it small." "Of course," I said, "he always hated big crowds." There was a pause on her end, a long one then. I wasn't sure you'd come." I let that sit, then answered, "I'll be there." She didn't say thank you, she just hung up. The sky was overcast, but not dramatically so. No rain, no thunder. Just that muted, heavy gray that settles over Florida mornings like a hush before hard truths. I parked down the street. Not because there wasn't space at the funeral home, but because I needed a moment. To breathe, to brace. As I stepped out of the car, I caught my reflection in the window, dark blazer. Hair pulled back. The gold locket around my neck, a quiet promise I'd kept since law school. Inside, a picture of Grandpa Walter. The only man in my family who ever told me I was enough. The chapel was smaller than I expected. A simple building tucked beside a line of oaks that looked like they'd been there longer than the town itself. When I stepped inside, the air changed. Not just because of the hush or the scent of lilies, but because every head in the room turned toward me. Slowly, coldly, like I was a stranger crashing someone else's grief. My mother stood near the front in a pale blue dress that clashed with the somber mood. She was whispering something to my aunt, but stopped the second she saw me. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. Enough to register surprise, maybe irritation. And there was Jason. Arms folded, chin up, suit crisp and expensive. He gave me that same smirk he used to wear on the porch all those years ago, except now it came with deeper lines and emptier eyes. "Look who finally remembered she's family," my mother muttered, not bothering to whisper as I passed. I didn't stop. I didn't flinch. I walked straight to the casket. Grandpa looked peaceful. Not hollow like some people do after they're gone. He looked complete. Like he'd finished the work he was meant to do. And part of me wanted to scream, because he didn't get to see what came next. But instead, I leaned in and whispered, "I'll make you proud, Grandpa, one last time." I stood there for a beat longer, ignoring the side eyes and the judgment thick in the room. Then I took a seat near the back. Close enough to see, far enough to stay out of whatever staged performance my family had planned. The service was short, clean, sanitized. They talked about Walter Collins, the war veteran, the loving father, the pillar of the community. But no one mentioned the books. The notebooks full of case strategy. The endless afternoons teaching his granddaughter how to outwit people who think the world belongs to them. No one said his name like it meant something personal, so I kept that part to myself. After the final prayer, people stood and milled around, shaking hands, offering bland condolences. I tried to slip out quietly, but of course I didn't make it 3 steps before I heard my father's voice. "So this is what brings you home." I turned. He looked older, more tired, but not changed. "I came to say goodbye," I said. "That's what decent people do." He scoffed. "You weren't around when he got sick, you never even called." That hit harder than I expected. "I didn't know he was sick," I replied. "No one told me." He didn't deny it, just pressed his lips into a line and looked away. Jason joined him, arms crossed. "You show up now, all polished up, trying to play the grieving granddaughter." "Jason," I said calmly, "this isn't a performance, I didn't come for you." I looked between them, my father, my brother, both staring at me like I didn't belong. And I realized they didn't recognize me anymore. Not just my clothes, my posture. My voice, they didn't recognize the version of Aaron that had survived without their approval. That scared them more than anything. So I let them stew. I walked past, silent, because the real fight wasn't here. Not yet, it was coming, and they had no idea that Grandpa had already armed me with everything I'd need. 3 days after the funeral, I walked into a lawyer's office that smelled like cedar, cigars, and old secrets. The walls were dark wood. Heavy shelves lined with law books no one had opened in a decade. An antique globe sat in the corner like a forgotten trophy. I'd been in a lot of law offices, but this one wasn't designed for work, it was built for legacy. My mother sat near the front, lips pursed, pearl necklace practically strangling her. Jason lounged next to her in a navy suit, tapping on his phone with one ankle slung over the opposite knee like he owned the place. My father stood stiffly near the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. He hadn't spoken to me since the funeral, not even a glance. I took the seat farthest from them. The air was so thick with resentment I could have filed it as evidence. Then the lawyer entered, a trim man in his 60s, glasses low on his nose, briefcase in hand. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling behind the desk. "We'll begin the reading of Walter Collins' last will and testament." Jason smirked like he already knew how this would go. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. "To my son, Douglas Collins," he paused. That was my father's full name. "I leave my fishing gear, my Navy medals, and my grandfather clock on the condition that he picks it up within 30 days. If not, it goes to charity." My father's jaw clenched. He said nothing. The lawyer continued. "To my grandson, Jason Collins." Jason straightened his tie. "I leave my record collection and my vintage turntable. You always claim to appreciate real music. Let's see if that holds up without Spotify." I bit back a smile. Jason frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "That's it." The lawyer ignored him. "And finally," he said, voice firm now, "to my granddaughter, Erin Collins." The room went still. "I leave the remainder of my estate, including all assets, properties, accounts, and holdings, totaling approximately $800,000. Silence. The only sound was Jason's phone slipping from his hand and hitting the carpet. My mother turned to the lawyer. "Must be some mistake." "There isn't," he replied without looking up. "That can't be right," Jason said, eyes wide. "She hasn't been part of this family for years." "She was the only one who never stopped seeing Walter as a person instead of a bank account," the lawyer said calmly. "And she was the only one he trusted to carry on his legacy." My father finally spoke, voice low and sharp. "This is absurd. She's a child." "She's an attorney," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm not a child anymore." The lawyer nodded, sliding a folder toward me. "Miss Collins, here are the documents to begin transferring the estate into your name." I took them, hands sure. Jason shot to his feet. "This is bull." "Jason," my mother hissed. "Sit down." "No," he snapped. "She doesn't deserve any of this. She vanished for years, and now she shows up at the funeral and gets everything." I stood slowly, turning to face him. "I didn't vanish. I built something. While you were too busy basking in secondhand praise, I was actually doing the work. Grandpa saw that." "You were just playing dress-up," Jason spat. "Now you think you're better than us." "No," I said, "I think I'm finally free of you." Jason's face burned red. He looked to my parents for backup, but they were both too stunned to speak. I turned to the lawyer. "Thank you for your time." "You're welcome, Miss Collins." He gave me a warm smile. "Your grandfather was very proud of you." I walked out with the folder pressed to my chest, the air outside somehow cooler than it had been all day. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. Because in that moment I realized something. Grandpa hadn't just left me money. He'd left me the power to write the ending to our story. And I was just getting started. For one quiet week, I let myself believe it was over. That maybe, just maybe, my family would lick their wounds in private and move on. That they'd accept what Grandpa had done and why he did it. But Collins don't lose graciously. Not when entitlement runs thicker than blood. It was Melody who burst into my office, slapping a stack of papers onto my desk like they were on fire. "You need to see this, now." I looked up from reviewing a pro bono eviction case, confused. "What is it?" She didn't answer. Just pushed the top sheet toward me. "Petition to challenge the validity of last will and testament of Walter Collins. Filed by Douglas Collins and Karen Collins, with supporting affidavits from Jason Collins." I scanned the rest, my eyes catching on the keywords like thorns. Undue influence, diminished mental capacity, suspected coercion, questionable legal soundness. "They're calling him senile," I whispered. Melody sat, watching my face. "They're saying you manipulated him. That you isolated him, pressured him to change the will." And they've got medical documentation claiming he showed signs of cognitive decline. I stared at the page, my throat closing up. That's a lie, I said. Of course it is, Melody snapped. But lies written on a doctor's letterhead, that's dangerous. I leaned back in my chair, pulse pounding in my ears. I need to see what they've got. Melody opened her bag and pulled out a copy of the attachments. A physician's report dated 3 months before Walter's passing. Claims early-stage dementia, mild but enough to question judgment. He didn't have dementia, I said, shaking my head. He was sharp, sharper than me some days. Then we'll prove it, she said, but even she looked rattled. Jason had signed a sworn affidavit saying I limited family communication, controlled access to Walter, and discouraged visits under the guise of protecting his peace. He only said that because Grandpa wouldn't let them in, I muttered. He didn't want them near his finances, near anything. But now it looks like you were hiding him, Melody said. And if the court buys that, they could void the entire will. The room spun for a moment. They're going to drag his name through the mud, I whispered. They already are, she replied softly. You're next. The door to my office creaked open again and Robbie stepped in, holding his phone. You're going to want to hear this, he said, pressing play on a voicemail. Jason's voice crackled through the speaker. You really thought you won, didn't you? You think one will is going to undo decades of family legacy? We'll bury this. You'll see, you don't belong here, Aaron. You never did. Melody's expression darkened. That's intimidation. It's a promise, I said coldly. I stood and walked to the window, watching the cars pass below. Atlanta felt louder that day, sharper, like even the city could sense what was coming. I need to get ahead of this, I said. We need records, letters, witnesses. From where? Robbie asked. Hospitals, his nurses. All of them, I said. Anyone who spent time with him in the last year of his life. I want video, handwriting, emails, anything that proves he was lucid, deliberate, and fully in control. And if they've doctored the medical records? Melody asked. I turned, my jaw set. Then we expose them, on paper, in court, and if I have to subpoena every nurse from Tampa to Tallahassee, I will. Melody stood beside me. They picked the wrong person to lie about. No, I said. They picked the wrong man to erase. I knew how court battles worked. I'd lived through enough of them, but this was different. They weren't just attacking me, they were rewriting Grandpa's legacy, painting him as a confused old man tricked by a manipulative granddaughter. They wanted to ruin both of us, not for justice, for revenge. And as I stared out the window, I knew this wouldn't be just a defense. It would be a war. I never imagined I'd be defending my grandfather like a client in court. But here I was, tracking timelines, digging through old emails, calling nurses I'd never met, trying to prove that the man who raised me wasn't some confused old soul tricked into signing his will. He knew, he chose. He did it with more clarity than the rest of my family had shown in a lifetime. Melody and I set up shop in our conference room. Whiteboards filled up with names and dates. Grandpa's hospital visits, calls he made, letters he sent. Even his Facebook comments. Yes, he used Facebook, were timestamped proof that his mind was sharp. He tagged me in a meme about Supreme Court justices, I said, pointing at a screenshot. He was making constitutional jokes 2 months before he died. God, I loved that man, Melody muttered, flipping through another folder. Okay, what about medical staff, any hospice notes? I called every nurse who worked the evening shift for his last 6 months. I opened a binder, thumbing through notes. 3 of them agreed to give statements. 1 gave me this. I held up a video, shaky but clear. A nurse named Elena had recorded Grandpa laughing over his crossword puzzles. The date was embedded in the corner, just 5 weeks before his death. The audio played. They think I'm losing my mind, Grandpa chuckled, pen in hand. But I just beat the Sunday edition of the Times in 22 minutes. Aaron's the only one who ever dared to time me. Then he looked straight into the camera. He's gonna be a hell of a lawyer someday. Better than I ever was. That's why she's getting it all. I trust her. Melody's eyes welled up. I didn't let myself cry. I couldn't, not yet. Instead, I called Nurse Elena. Would you be willing to testify? She didn't hesitate. For Walter Collins, absolutely. He talked about you like you were his heartbeat. After that, we tracked down his old law partner, retired now, living in North Georgia. I drove out on a Sunday with a notepad and a recorder. He greeted me on the porch with a weak smile. So you're Aaron. He told me you'd come knocking someday. I blinked. He did. When the vultures show their teeth, my girl will be ready, he said. That was Walter. We sat on his back porch, sipping tea while he recounted Grandpa's final visit. He brought the will, asked me to read it over, asked questions, made adjustments. His mind was a steel trap, and I told him so. I pulled out a recorder. Would you be willing to say that again on the record? He smiled. Gladly. When I got back to Atlanta, Melody and Robbie had even more. They'd combed through Grandpa's handwritten legal essays. He'd written 6 full-length briefs in the final 3 months of his life. Complex arguments, flawless structure, tight logic. One of them was dated the same week Jason's doctor claimed he was in cognitive decline. We cross-referenced this with the nurse's testimony and the will revisions, Robbie said, and it's airtight. Except for the forged records, Melody added. We still need to prove that someone tampered with those files. I nodded. That's next. I drove back to the hospice facility 2 days later and met with the administrator, a no-nonsense woman named Marie with salt and pepper curls and reading glasses she never actually wore. I'm not supposed to talk to you without a court order, she said, arms crossed. I set down a copy of the medical summary Jason had filed. Then just tell me if this looks like your paperwork. She scanned the pages, her eyebrows shot up. This isn't our format, she said. We don't use this header and this doctor hasn't worked here in 5 years. My heart thudded. Would you sign a statement saying that? Marie looked me in the eye. If someone's forging our records to alter a will, you bet I will. By the end of the week, I had everything. 3 nurses with statements and video. A former law partner who reviewed the will. Legal writings dated to the exact days he was allegedly confused. A facility administrator ready to testify that the medical records were fabricated. And in the middle of it all was the truth. He gave it to me because he trusted me, not because he was manipulated. I stood in the office late that Friday, the folder heavy in my arms. Melody walked in, holding a cup of coffee. Trial's next week, she said softly. I know. You ready? I looked down at the folder. I've been ready since I was 16. The courtroom smelled like fresh varnish and old injustice. I stood just outside the heavy double doors, smoothing the hem of my vintage brown suit. It was Grandpa's favorite, the one I wore to my first real case. The one he called my "don't mess with me" armor. I adjusted the bun at the nape of my neck and took one long breath. When I stepped inside, the world sharpened. My parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a pair of stiff-jawed attorneys with smug smiles. Jason sat just behind them, tapping his pen like he was auditioning for a tantrum. I walked down the center aisle alone. No fanfare, no entourage, just me and everything I carried. My mother leaned toward one of their lawyers, whispering behind a manicured hand. Jason turned in his seat, eyes trailing me with theatrical disbelief. You didn't even hire a lawyer, he called out with a laugh that echoed too loud in the chamber. Pathetic. I didn't blink. Because I had seen what pathetic looked like, it was dressed in entitlement, clinging to lies like a lifeline. I placed my briefcase on the defense table, opened it slowly, and laid out my materials with surgical care. The judge entered. A tall woman with silver curls and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She adjusted her robes and gave the room a quiet once-over. Then her eyes landed on me. Miss Collins, she said, voice warm with recognition. Welcome back. Who are you representing today? I stood, chin high. Myself, Your Honor. Gasps rustled through the room like wind through dry leaves. My mother's purse slipped from her lap and hit the floor with a muted thud. Jason's mouth hung open like a cartoon. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a glance. Proceed, the judge said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The plaintiff's attorneys began with a cold, polished version of the story. An old man vulnerable. A granddaughter with too much access. A sudden dramatic change in the will. They used words like coerced, confused, mentally compromised. I watched my father keep his face carefully blank, while my mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that never once touched tears. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, walking toward the jury with deliberate steps. No theatrics, no raised voice, just truth. My grandfather was not confused, I said. He was deliberate, sharp, and tired of being treated like a cash register. I handed the court clerk Exhibit A, the hospice video of Grandpa completing a crossword, time-stamped and clear. The courtroom watched as he looked into the camera and said, "She's gonna be a hell of a lawyer someday, that's why she's getting it all." I moved on to Exhibit B, the signed statement from his former law partner. He reviewed the will, adjusted it, Knew exactly what he wanted, I explained. And this man, this witness, was there to confirm it. Exhibit C. The facility director's signed statement identifying the dementia diagnosis as falsified. Your Honor, I said, locking eyes with the judge, not only was the decedent mentally sound, but the plaintiffs knowingly submitted forged documents in an attempt to alter the will. I heard my mother inhale sharply. Jason sank lower in his seat. I returned to the table and held up the final file. Everything I've submitted is verifiable, all of it. Then I turned to face my family directly for the first time. You didn't come after me because you cared about Grandpa's health, I said. You came after me because you couldn't control him, and you hated that he saw me for who I was becoming. Their silence was louder than any gavel. The judge recessed for deliberation. As I walked out of the courtroom, shoulders back, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt whole. Because for the first time, I had defended someone I loved from the lies of people who had shared my last name but never my truth. And I wasn't done yet. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. I sat alone, hands folded, waiting for the verdict. The judge had been gone for nearly an hour. My heartbeat pulsed steady in my ears, but my expression never cracked. I'd practiced stillness for years. My parents sat 2 rows ahead, their attorneys whispering furiously between them. Jason picked at his cuticle like he was waiting on a nail salon appointment, not a legal ruling that could unravel the last thread of their fabricated reality. When the bailiff finally opened the doors, everyone stood. I rose too, slow and deliberate, as the judge returned to the bench. She shuffled the verdict papers quietly, her eyes scanning the room before they landed on me. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds no grounds to support the claim of undue influence or mental incompetence. The will stands as written. A sharp gasp broke from my mother's lips. Jason's face drained of color, so fast it looked like someone pulled the life right out of him. But the judge wasn't done. This court is also concerned by the forged medical documents submitted as evidence. An investigation into their origin will be opened immediately. And just like that, the room turned colder than it had ever been. My father finally looked at me for the first time since the funeral. Not with fury or disbelief or even regret, just shock. Like he didn't know the woman standing across from him, because he didn't. The woman who used to sit quietly while they dismissed her, ignored her, mocked her ambition was gone. This version of me had just buried their entire argument and their pride under the weight of truth. The judge banged her gavel and court was dismissed. I turned to gather my things, slow and methodical. Let them watch. Let them feel what it meant to lose. In the hallway, Melody was waiting, eyes wide and shining. You did it, she breathed. They did it to themselves, I said softly. I just refused to let them get away with it. As I stepped outside, the Florida sun cut through the clouds for the first time that day. Warm and honest. Unapologetic. Jason stormed out behind me, heels clacking like a bad performance. This isn't over, Aaron, he spat, his voice low and bitter. You embarrassed us. You think that's not going to come back around? I turned slowly, facing him full on. I didn't embarrass you, I said calmly. You did that all by yourself. He sneered. You think you're better than us now? No, I said, stepping closer. I know I am, because when it came down to truth or lies, I showed up with facts. You showed up with forgeries. He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. Let me make something very clear, Jason, I said, my voice firm but quiet. Next time you call me pathetic, remember who buried you in court. Melody let out a tiny gasp beside me, then grinned behind her coffee. Jason stared at me, eyes hollow, then turned and walked away. No last word, no comeback, no defense. My mother and father followed, their heads low. There would be no redemption arc for them, not this time. That was the moment it truly hit me. Not just that I had won, but that I had reclaimed something they never thought I would, my voice. Grandpa once told me that law wasn't just about rules, it was about revealing people for who they really are. And today I had, in front of a judge, a courtroom, and the very people who tried to erase both of us. The day the new sign went up, I stood across the street, coffee in hand, staring at it like it might disappear if I blinked too long. Walter Legal Group. Etched in brushed steel. Sharp, clean lines, bold letters that held more than just a name. They held every late-night lesson, every whispered encouragement, every ounce of faith Grandpa ever placed in me. Melody walked up beside me, tucking her hands into her coat pockets. It looks like it's always been there. It should have always been there, I said softly. The inheritance had come through 2 weeks earlier. No appeals, no more surprises. My family had slithered back into the shadows, licking their wounds in silence. But I wasn't about to waste the gift they tried so hard to steal. The money didn't go to a luxury condo or a flashy car. It went to desks, outreach clinics, an entire wing dedicated to legal aid for people who couldn't afford it, exactly what Grandpa had dreamed of but never had the time or means to build. "Do you think he'd be proud?" I asked. Melody tilted her head. "Proud. Aaron, he'd be insufferable with pride. He'd be out here handing out flyers and telling every passerby, 'That's my girl, she made this.'" I laughed quietly, my chest tightening with something like peace. Inside, the office buzzed with a quiet energy. Clients filled the lobby. Our new junior associates clicked away at their keyboards. The air smelled like fresh coffee and purpose. This wasn't just a firm. It was proof. Proof that I hadn't been the lost child they pretended I was. Proof that I could build something from ashes, something honorable, something permanent. "He gave me more than money," I said, watching the light catch on the metal sign. "He gave me back myself." And that was something no one, not my mother, not Jason, not even the legal system, could ever take away again. 10 years later, I stood behind a podium at Southern Atlantic Law, staring into a sea of bright eyes and open notebooks. Future attorneys, future fighters, future Aarons. The auditorium buzzed with quiet energy, some students already looking bored, others leaning forward, waiting for the story they'd heard rumors about. The one about the woman who beat her own family in court, who won something bigger than a verdict. I smiled, not because I needed to impress them, but because I remembered exactly what it felt like to sit where they were sitting. Hungry, tired, unseen. "My name is Aaron Collins," I began, voice steady, "and 10 years ago I inherited a fight." They leaned in. Some people inherit money, others inherit names. I inherited fire and someone who taught me where to aim it. Laughter echoed through the room. Light, real. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a lawyer, I just knew what it felt like to be dismissed, overlooked, told to quiet down when I asked too many questions. I paused, scanning the room. Some of them nodded. Some just stared, still trying to figure me out. "You're going to learn case law, torts, statutes. But I'm here to tell you, none of that matters if you don't know who you are in a room full of people who think you don't belong." That part always hit the ones who needed it. Afterward, a few students lingered. One girl with tight braids and a nervous smile approached me, clutching a well-worn notebook. "Ms. Collins," she asked quietly, "how did you know you were ready to fight them? Your family, I mean." I looked at her, really looked at her. And I saw myself at 19, sitting in Grandpa's study, tracing the edges of a casebook I didn't understand yet. "I didn't," I said, "but I knew I couldn't let them rewrite the truth, and that was enough." She smiled like I'd handed her something more than words. Later that night, I sat alone in my office at Walter Legal Group, a warm light casting shadows across the bookshelves. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the locket. Opened it. Grandpa's face smiled up at me, still steady, still proud. "We did it," I whispered. And somehow, I knew he'd always known I would.